Without plants, humans and most other organisms wouldn't be able to live. Through photosynthesis, plants convert solar energy into chemical energy. The chemical energy is then passed from organism to organism. Similar to the way energy passes through an ecosystem, chemical elements including carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus move through an ecosystem. While energy has to be constantly supplied, chemical elements are recycled. Following the exact path an element takes as it cycles through an ecosystem is difficult. An ecosystem is very complex, and material can move between different ecosystems, such as in runoff and precipitation. However, we can follow the general path an element takes as it cycles through soil, water, organisms, and in some cases, the atmosphere. As an element cycles through an ecosystem, it may be found in several different forms. Some forms can be used by organisms, and other forms are unusable. For example, the carbon in gaseous carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is unavailable for use by heterotrophs. However, the carbon can be used once an autotroph incorporates it into a carbohydrate through photosynthesis. In this activity, we'll explore how several elements cycle through an ecosystem. We'll start by looking at the cycling of carbon, then nitrogen, and finally, phosphorus. We'll also investigate how humans are altering the balance of each of these chemical element cycles. We just learned that some chemical forms of an element are usable by heterotrophic organisms, while others are not. An example of this occurs in the cycling between the chemical forms of carbon. Carbon is the basic building block of organic compounds. During photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is used to generate oxygen and carbohydrates, which are used for chemical energy. The carbon is incorporated back into carbon dioxide during cellular respiration. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration cycle carbon between forms that are unusable and usable by heterotrophs. Carbon in the atmosphere is found mainly as carbon dioxide. Primary producers like plants use carbon dioxide to produce carbohydrates. The plants are eaten by primary consumers, which are eaten by higher-level consumers. When plants and animals die, they become food for detritivores. Cellular respiration by plants, animals, and detritivores and the burning of fuels return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and the cycle begins again. Carbon dioxide is cycled out of the atmosphere rapidly because plants need it for photosynthesis. Each year, plants remove about 15% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is roughly balanced by the amount of carbon dioxide released from cellular respiration. The balance between carbon dioxide produced and released isn't perfect because some carbon is removed from the cycle for a period of time. Some carbon is diverted from the cycle because it's incorporated in wood or other durable organic material. The carbon is eventually returned to the cycle when it is broken down by detritivores or burned. Certain conditions can cause organic material to be buried and isolated before it can be decomposed. These deposits become fossil fuels, which include petroleum and coal. Fossil fuels are composed of the remains of organisms preserved in the Earth's crust. Carbon is also removed from the cycle in the form of calcium carbonate found in the shells of some aquatic organisms. As it accumulates, the calcium carbonate forms limestone. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is also affected by the season. The level of atmospheric carbon dioxide is lowest during summer in the northern hemisphere. When we think about the carbon cycle, this makes perfect sense. The northern hemisphere has a larger land mass and more vegetation than the southern hemisphere. Therefore, more photosynthesis occurs because of the vegetation in the northern hemisphere. And more photosynthesis occurs in the summer than the winter. One aspect of the carbon cycle we haven't discussed is the role of aquatic carbon. Carbon is found in several chemical forms in water. Atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolves in water. The dissolved carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then reacts with calcium carbonate in shells and limestone to form bicarbonate, which reacts to form carbonate. All of these reactions are in equilibrium, so the amount of one chemical form affects the amount of the other forms. As dissolved carbon dioxide is used by aquatic plants for photosynthesis, all the equilibria shift to the left to produce more carbon dioxide. If the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, more carbon dioxide is dissolved in the water, and all the equilibria shift to the right. This is important because it means the oceans help keep the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide relatively stable. The role of the oceans in buffering the atmospheric carbon dioxide level is increasingly important because of the involvement of humans. One way humans are affecting the environment is by releasing large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are the petroleum we use to run cars and the coal we burn to operate factories. In the last 2 decades, the burning of fossil fuels by humans has released close to 80 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. However, the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide has only increased by about half that amount, probably because the oceans have absorbed most of the difference. We've seen how carbon is cycled from unusable to usable forms as it moves through an ecosystem. The atmospheric form of carbon, carbon dioxide, is unusable by heterotrophs, and it must be converted to a usable form by autotrophs. Another important element, nitrogen, has an unusable atmospheric form that must be converted. But as we'll see in a moment, primary producers aren't responsible for the conversion. Nitrogen is found in all amino acids and therefore in all proteins. It is also found in the nitrogenous bases that make up DNA. Most nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form of nitrogen gas, N2. Nitrogen gas is not a usable form of nitrogen for plants. Plants can only use nitrogen when it's in the form of either ammonium or nitrate. A small amount of atmospheric nitrogen is made up of ammonium and nitrate, which are deposited in the soil by rain. But this only makes up 5 to 10% of the nitrogen used by plants. Let's see how nitrogen gas is converted to ammonium and nitrate. The process of converting nitrogen in the atmosphere to usable forms is a complex process called nitrogen fixation. Certain prokaryotes convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia, NH3. The bacteria use some ammonia for their own metabolism and release the excess. Most soil is acidic, so the ammonia picks up a hydrogen ion to form ammonium, NH4. Some of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria have a symbiotic relationship with a specific plant. For example, some legumes have root nodules that contain the nitrogen-fixing bacterium rhizobium. Other nitrogen-fixing bacteria are free-living in the soil. In aquatic environments, some cyanobacteria carry out nitrogen fixation. Ammonium is also produced by the decomposition of organic material, a process called ammonification. Ammonification is carried out primarily by bacterial and fungal decomposers. Ammonium in the soil can be used directly by plants, but most of it is converted to nitrate in a process called nitrification. Nitrifying bacteria in the soil convert ammonium to nitrites and then to nitrates. The nitrates can then be used by plants. Nitrates are removed from the soil as they are incorporated into plants. Nitrates are also removed in a process called denitrification. In anaerobic conditions, some bacteria get their oxygen from nitrate. In the process, nitrate is converted to nitrogen gas and released back into the atmosphere. While the nitrogen cycle includes atmospheric nitrogen, most cycling actually occurs between the soil and organisms. Nitrogen fixation accounts for only a small amount of the nitrogen incorporated by plants. But many plants still have symbiotic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Most nitrogen is recycled locally through decomposition, ammonification, nitrification, and incorporation. Just as humans affect the carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels, we are also having an impact on the nitrogen cycle. To make fertilizer, factories convert large quantities of atmospheric nitrogen to nitrates. Industrial fixation has doubled the nitrogen fixation rate. The excess nitrates found in fertilizers end up in runoff and eventually make their way to lakes and rivers. The excess nitrates can lead to areas of overgrowth of algae and aquatic plants. The extra growth of aquatic plants and algae may not seem like a big problem. However, when the algae and plants die, decomposers use up all the oxygen in the water for cellular respiration. As a result, all of the aerobic life in the water, including fish, does not have enough oxygen, and they die. This is an example of how human involvement can have far-reaching repercussions, and it demonstrates why we must be careful in the way we manipulate our ecosystems for our own use. To see how well you understand the nitrogen cycle, drag the labels to the appropriate place on the diagram. You may have to use a label more than once. Nitrogen gas deposited in the soil is converted to ammonium through nitrogen fixation. Ammonium is also produced through decomposition, a process called ammonification. The ammonium is converted to nitrite and then nitrate through nitrification. Nitrates can be used by plants. Nitrates can also be converted to nitrogen gas through denitrification. In the cycling of carbon and nitrogen, one step in the cycle is converting the atmospheric form to a usable form. But not all elements are present in the atmosphere at a significant level. The third element we'll look at is phosphorus, which has no significant atmospheric form. This makes the phosphorus cycle simpler than the carbon and nitrogen cycles. Phosphorus is an important building block of DNA, as well as a component of phospholipids in cell membranes, energy molecules like ATP, and even our bones. There is only one important inorganic form of phosphorus, and that's phosphate. Plants absorb phosphate from the soil and water and use it to synthesize organic molecules, which are passed on to consumers. Phosphate is added back to the soil by the decomposition of dead material and feces. Phosphates are also added to soil and water through the weathering of rocks. Phosphates generally bind to soil particles and cycle locally. But some phosphates are carried away by groundwater and runoff and are eventually deposited in lakes, rivers, and oceans. Phosphates in the ocean settle to the ocean floor and become sediment. For the phosphates to return to the cycle, a geological upheaval must bring the sediment to the surface. In the same way that fertilizer adds excess nitrogen to lakes and rivers, it also adds phosphates to the water. Phosphates are often the limiting nutrient in an ecosystem. Even if excess nitrates are present, algae usually won't grow unless phosphates are added. Therefore, it's extremely important that we make sure phosphates aren't released into the water. In order to keep our ecosystems clean and safe, many states have banned detergents containing phosphates. Most people realize plants are important because they release the oxygen that we breathe. But plants are also important because of their role in the cycling of chemical elements through ecosystems. Plants convert elements from inorganic forms into biological molecules that can be used by consumers. We looked at the cycling of three important elements: carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Carbon is the basic building block of organic compounds. The main cycling of carbon occurs through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide into a form usable by consumers. Cellular respiration, performed by all organisms, returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The burning of fossil fuels by humans also releases carbon dioxide into the air we breathe. Carbon is removed temporarily from the cycle when it is incorporated into wood or isolated as coal or petroleum. Carbon can also be taken out of the cycle when it is accumulated into calcium carbonate shells. Calcium carbonate is one form of aquatic carbon. The aquatic forms of carbon help absorb some of the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere caused by the burning of fossil fuels by humans. Like carbon, nitrogen has an atmospheric form that is unusable by most organisms. Atmospheric nitrogen must be converted to ammonium or nitrate before it can be used by plants. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria, either symbiotic or free-living, convert nitrogen gas to ammonia, which picks up a hydrogen ion to become ammonium. Ammonium is also produced by decomposition. Nitrifying bacteria convert the ammonium to nitrites and then to nitrates, which are used by plants. Denitrifying bacteria convert a small amount of nitrate to nitrogen gas. Most nitrogen cycling is local between decomposition, nitrification, and incorporation. Unlike carbon and nitrogen, phosphorus doesn't have a significant atmospheric form, so its cycle is less complex. The only important inorganic form of phosphorus is phosphate. Plants use phosphates in the soil to synthesize organic molecules. Phosphate is added back to the soil by the decomposition of dead material and feces. Phosphate is also added to soil through the weathering of rocks. The cycling of elements is important for an ecosystem. In order for the organisms that live in an ecosystem to survive, the amount of each element must be balanced. Humans are disrupting this balance. Through the burning of fossil fuels, we are releasing large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which in turn alters the levels of aquatic carbon forms. If we continue to release high levels of carbon dioxide, it may have a negative effect on the health of our ecosystems. Fertilizers also change the balance of elements in an ecosystem. fertilizers add large quantities of nitrates and phosphates to the soil. These nutrients are carried in groundwater to nearby lakes and streams. The excess nutrients can cause the rapid growth and overgrowth of plants and algae. When the plants and algae die, the decomposers use all the oxygen from the water for cellular respiration, and all other forms of aquatic life eventually die. Sometimes the long-term effects of human actions aren't easy to predict. To keep the Earth's ecosystems healthy, we must be careful to avoid disrupting the natural cycling of chemical elements.